It is 1938. A German Jewish intellectual arrives in New York Harbor with 2 suitcases and a head full of Beethoven. Behind him, everything is burning. His teaching license has been revoked. His father has been arrested. The family's property has been seized. The world of high culture that raised him, that taught him to play piano before he could read, has been revealed as no protection at all. The Nazis didn't care. This man's name was Theodor Adorno, and over the next 3 decades, he would become one of the most influential thinkers of the 20th century, a man whose ideas shaped how we understand mass media, fascism, and the dark side of progress itself. Tonight, we trace his extraordinary life, a childhood so sheltered it belonged to the 19th century. Then, his exile, first to Oxford, then to Los Angeles, where he watched the horrors of Europe unfold from a bungalow in the California sun. And finally, his return to the country that tried to destroy him, where he became a voice on the radio, a professor who packed lecture halls until his own students turned on him. Before we begin, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It really helps others discover these explorations of history. And let us know in the comments which topics you'd like us to explore next. Now, Adorno was a man of contradictions, a critic of mass culture who used the radio to reach millions, a thinker so difficult that even his admirers joked about not understanding him, yet so compelling that students packed his lectures. He believed that after Auschwitz, the old ways of thinking had failed. Philosophy itself needed to be rebuilt from the ruins. So settle in now as we follow this restless mind from the piano rooms of Frankfurt to the exile colonies of California and back again. We'll meet the mentors who shaped him, the collaborators who challenged him, and the radicals who finally drove him from his own podium. His story is the story of the 20th century itself, told through one man who refused to look away. This is the bedtime biography of Theodor Adorno. Chapter 1. The Protected Enclave. The story begins on the 11th of September, 1903, in the city of Frankfurt am Main. A house called Schöne Aussicht sat on the embankment of the river Main, where the Wiesengrund family had built their wine business decades earlier. It was here that Theodor Ludwig Wiesengrund came into the world. His grandfather David had moved the family from a small town in Lower Franconia, seeking opportunity in the city. By the time Theodor arrived, the Wiesengrunds had become respectable merchants, part of the upper middle class, though never quite accepted by the old Frankfurt families who traced their lineages back centuries. His father, Oscar, had converted to Protestantism years before. This was not unusual for German Jews of the time, who sought to move freely in society, to bypass the citizenship laws and their costs, to assimilate into a world that demanded conformity as the price of admission. Oscar cultivated the manner of an English gentleman. He wore the right clothes and spoke in the right way. He had married Maria Calvelli Adorno in London in 1898, partly to avoid the religious complications that would have arisen in Frankfurt. Maria was Catholic, a singer of some renown who had performed at the court in Vienna. She brought with her a sister named Agathe, a pianist, and together these 2 women would shape the boy's early life more than anyone else. The household at Schurno-Aussicht was unusual. It did not operate by the rigid schedules and stern expectations of the typical bourgeois home. Music filled the rooms. Maria carried what Theodor would later call the aura of the singer, that particular presence of someone who had stood before audiences and commanded their attention. Agathe became a second mother to the boy. She was the one who sat with him at the piano, teaching him to play duets before he could properly read. He followed his ear and his memory, absorbing music not as a discipline to be mastered, but as a language he already spoke. The family called him Teddy. He was precocious and knew it. There are stories of him wandering onto stages, uninvited to recite poems, already hungry for applause at an age when most children can barely string sentences together. He grew up surrounded by women who adored him, in a home where the harsh realities of commerce and competition were kept at a distance. His father's wine business sustained everything, but the boy remained sheltered from the mechanics of earning a living. He existed in what he would later describe as a hothouse, a protected space where he could grow according to his own nature. Sorry for the interruption. This is Charles from History After Dark, a channel that is entirely viewer-funded. I cannot produce these deep-dive documentaries without your direct support. A pledge of just a few dollars a month via Patreon or as a YouTube member provides the material base that keeps this channel alive. In return for your solidarity, you gain early access to episodes, direct voting rights on future topics, and a completely ad-free experience. Thank you. Now, back to the story. He became fascinated by his mother's name, Calvelli Adorno. It sounded aristocratic, Italian, mysterious. He would later adopt Adorno as his own surname, linking himself to an old Genoese family called Adorno della Piana. Whether this connection was real or imagined hardly mattered. The name gave him something to hold on to, a sense of distinction that set him apart from the ordinary world of merchants and clerks. It was a kind of armor, constructed in childhood, that he would wear for the rest of his life. In 1914, the family moved to a new house at Seeheimerstrasse in the suburb of Oberrad. It was a narrower place, a row house, chosen for its convenience to the business rather than its elegance. The grand views of the river were gone, but inside the same atmosphere persisted. The two mothers continued their work, music continued to fill the evenings. Teddy continued to grow in his hothouse, turning toward the warmth of maternal attention like a plant toward sunlight. Years later, Theodor would try to explain what this childhood had meant. He said that what we realize in life is little more than the attempt to recover our childhood in a different form. He was trying to articulate something about the power of those early years, how they had shaped everything that came after. His friend, Leo Lowenthal, would call it a protected, beautiful life. And it was beautiful, but it was also fragile. The walls of the hothouse were made of glass. Outside those walls, the 20th century was gathering force. The old European order was approaching its final crisis. In a few years, the guns of August would shatter the illusion that civilization had conquered barbarism. But for now, in the house at Oberrad, a boy played piano with his aunt and dreamed of aristocratic ancestors. He did not know that the world he was being prepared for had already begun to disappear. He did not know that the very qualities his mothers had cultivated in him, the sensitivity, the artistic temperament, the expectation of being understood and appreciated, would make the coming decades almost unbearable. He was skinless, though he did not know it yet, and the world outside was sharpening its edges. Chapter 2. The Bad Comrades and the Cracked World. The Gymnasium in Sachsenhausen had adopted modern teaching methods, progressive by the standards of the time. Teddy entered at age 10, and within weeks he was top of every class, admired by some, envied by others. The teachers noted his quickness, his fluency, the way he could hold forth on subjects boys twice his age struggled to grasp. He was, by any measure, a prodigy, and prodigies, as a rule, do not fare well in schoolyards. There was a group that called itself the Harmless Club. The name was a joke, of course. Erich Pfeiffer Belli, a classmate, remembered how Tedchen Wiesengrund would be chased across the playground by a howling mob. They mocked his manner, his seriousness, the way he spoke, and then came the other thing, the thing that cut deeper, boys shouting after him in the corridors. "Greetings to Father Abraham!" The words hung in the air. Teddy's family attended church. They were assimilated, cultured, German to the core. None of it mattered. The boys saw what they wanted to see. Adorno would later call this the nightmare of childhood, the pursuit by the collective, the pack hunting the one who stood apart. He understood, even then, that this was something more than ordinary schoolboy cruelty. There was a logic to it, a rehearsal. The playground mob prefigured something darker, something that would take decades to arrive in its full and terrible form. He could not have named it yet, but he felt it in his body, in the racing of his heart as he ran. The school itself became a kind of lesson. He experienced it as the prototype of societal alienation, a place where teachers ceased to be human beings and became instead mediators of abstract, coercive information. The warmth of his mother's parlour, the four-handed piano duets with Agathi, the poems recited for admiring relatives, all of that belonged to another world entirely. Here, knowledge arrived stripped of pleasure. Authority wore a mask. The institution ground forward according to its own necessities, indifferent to the individual souls passing through it. Meanwhile, the world outside was tearing itself apart. The First World War began in 1914 and did not end until 1918. Teddy was too young to serve. He watched from a distance as the older boys disappeared, as the newspapers filled with casualty lists, as the rhetoric of nationalism and patriotism saturated every public space. He developed a quiet habit of resistance. He used foreign words in his speech and writing, small acts of linguistic defiance against the chauvinism that demanded everything be German. French phrases, Latin tags, little cells of opposition embedded in his sentences. It was during these years that he met Siegfried Krakauer. The introduction came through a family friend, Rosie Stern. Krakauer was 14 years older, an architect by training who had drifted toward journalism and philosophy. He was also an outsider in ways that Teddy was only beginning to understand. Krakauer had suffered from a speech defect as a child. He walked through the world with a perpetual sense of not quite belonging, of observing from a slight remove. Someone later described him as a man with no skin. Everything got through to him. Every slight, every cold shoulder, every moment of exclusion left its mark. The contrast with Teddy could hardly have been sharper. Here was a boy raised in material comfort, surrounded by adoring women, possessed of what Krakauer himself noted as a wonderfully self-confident character. And here was a man who had learned to see the world from the position of the foreigner, the one who does not fit. They recognized something in each other nonetheless. Perhaps it was the shared seriousness. Perhaps it was simply that Krakauer needed a student and Teddy needed a teacher who would not speak down to him. On Saturday afternoons, Krakauer came to the house on Seeheimer Strasse. They read Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason together. This was not how philosophy was taught in schools. Krakauer did not present Kant as a monument to be admired from a safe distance. He taught Teddy to read the text against itself, to find the places where the argument stumbled, where contradictions surfaced despite the author's best efforts at system building. The more eloquent passages within the work are the wounds this conflict has left in the theory. Philosophy was not a seamless architecture of truth. It was a battlefield. The scars were visible if you knew how to look. This changed everything. Teddy learned to see his own familiar world from the outside. The bourgeois culture he had absorbed as naturally as breathing now appeared as something constructed, something that could be questioned. Krakauer's experiential stance, that of the perpetual foreigner, became a method. You did not have to be excluded to adopt the gaze of the excluded. You could choose it. You could make it a tool. The friendship was intense, but it was not equal. Krakauer felt the gap keenly. He wrote about Teddy's admirable material existence, the comfort and security that the younger man took for granted. Teddy, for his part, sensed something unsettling in Krakauer's problematic sense of belongingness, the way the older man never quite settled into any position, any identity, any home. It was a preview of arguments to come, of tensions that would surface decades later. For now, though, they read Kant. They talked. The war ended. The German Empire collapsed. Teddy matriculated. He wrote essays defending the necessity of teachers as authority figures, even as he absorbed the revolutionary currents swirling through the intellectual climate. His teachers had been patriots. One of them, Reinhold Zickel, embodied the nationalist fervor that Teddy found so oppressive. And yet the concept of autonomy that Teddy had learned in part from those same teachers, could be turned against them. He began to do exactly that. An aesthetic left-wing radicalism took shape, half-formed, seeking its proper expression. The beautiful life of the parental home had been an island. He understood that now. The rancor of the collective, the violence of history, the cold machinery of institutions, all of it pressed in from every side. The private tutorials with Krakauer had given him tools. The gymnasium had given him wounds. He needed a new arena, somewhere that could hold his expanding ambition his strange combination of artistic passion and theoretical hunger. The rebellion that had begun in his mother's parlour, reading philosophy on Saturday afternoons, now required a larger stage. Chapter 3. The Constellation of Friends. Frankfurt University was a young institution when Adorno arrived in 1921. It had been founded just a few years earlier, built on money from the city's Jewish merchant families who wanted something different from the old Prussian academies. The place hummed with possibility. Adorno enrolled to study philosophy, sociology, psychology, and music history, moving between disciplines as though they were rooms in the same house. It was in a psychology seminar taught by Ademar Gelb that he first noticed Max Horkheimer. Horkheimer sat apart from the other students. He looked less like someone scrambling for a degree and more like a young gentleman from a wealthy family who had wandered in out of curiosity. There was something detached about him, skeptical, as though he were watching the proceedings from a slight remove. Adorno walked up to him after class and introduced himself. He was 20 years old. Horkheimer was 28. The friendship that began that day would become the central intellectual partnership of Adorno's life. They shared something fundamental. Both sensed that the old ways of thinking about art and beauty were inadequate in the face of what was happening to the world. Horkheimer had already spent time in his father's textile business. He knew how money moved, how systems operated. He combined a sharp skepticism with what Adorno later described as a will to survive. For the younger man, still wrapped in his musical and philosophical enthusiasms, this was fascinating. Here was someone who had seen more of the machine and remained intact. Then there was Walter Benjamin. Adorno encountered him in 1923, probably at a seminar or at the Café West End, one of those smoke-filled rooms where intellectuals gathered to argue over coffee. Benjamin was something else entirely. His philosophy, Adorno said, sounded as if it emerged from a mystery, possessing a power that overwhelms the eye to the point of tears. Benjamin looked at history differently. Where others saw grand narratives of progress, he saw debris and ruins. His method was micrological, examining the fragments that the victors had swept aside. His translation of Baudelaire, his strange and brilliant study of German tragic drama, these works showed Adorno a way of thinking he had never encountered before. Adorno found himself moving within a constellation of Jewish intellectuals. Krakauer was still there, his Saturday afternoon mentor. Now there was Horkheimer, Benjamin, and Leo Löwenthal, another young thinker, grappling with similar questions. They were all, in their different ways, trying to understand what had gone wrong. The bourgeois promises of the 19th century had collapsed. The German Revolution of 1918 had failed. The old certainties about culture and progress and reason had crumbled, and these young men were picking through the wreckage. The inflation of 1923 made things worse. The German currency became worthless almost overnight. Life savings evaporated. The comfortable middle-class existence that Benjamin had hoped to lead, the life of a private scholar supported by a modest inheritance, became impossible. The material basis of the old order was dissolving. This economic catastrophe forced a radicalization of their thinking. You could not simply write about aesthetics when the world was burning. Adorno completed his doctorate in 1924, at the age of 21. His dissertation was on Husserl, supervised by Hans Cornelius. It was a technically competent piece of work, orthodox and careful, showing little of the radical voice he would later develop. This was strategic. He needed the qualification to secure academic standing. The wild ideas could wait. And yet he remained torn. Philosophy pulled him one way, music another. He was publishing critiques of the new music in journals like the Musikblätter des Embruch, writing about Schoenberg and the avant-garde with genuine passion. He still wanted to be a composer, to create rather than merely analyze. The theories of Georg Lukács, particularly his 1923 book, History and Class Consciousness, offered a way to combine aesthetic sensitivity with rigorous social critique. These ideas circulated among the group, discussed at gatherings and in letters. That same year, the Institute for Social Research was founded in Frankfurt, bankrolled by the wealthy Hermann Weyl, and initially directed by Karl Grünberg. It would eventually become Adorno's institutional home, but for now he remained on the periphery. His radicalism was aesthetic rather than strictly political. He saw the musical revolution of Schoenberg as running parallel to the social revolution, a music that repudiated complicity of every kind. He had navigated the academic hurdles successfully. He had his doctorate. He had assembled a network of brilliant friends who shared his disillusionment with the old order. But something was missing. The academic path in Germany felt increasingly narrow. His creative impulse remained unsatisfied by purely theoretical work. The Second Viennese School of Music, Schoenberg and his circle, represented the true vanguard of modernism. To resolve the conflict between his theoretical intellect and his need to create, he would have to leave Frankfurt and test himself in the capital of the new music. Chapter 4. The Vienna School. Teddy arrived in Vienna in the early summer of 1925. He was 21 years old, freshly minted as a doctor of philosophy, and he came bearing a letter addressed to Alban Berg. The letter was precise, almost clinical. He introduced himself as Dr. T. Wiesengrund Adorno and announced exactly what he needed: composition lessons. He could tell Berg quite precisely what help he required. Vienna in those years was a city that had the future behind it. The aesthetic revolution of 1910 had already happened. The great ruptures in music, the shattering of tonality, the 12-tone method, all of it had hardened into something like a new tradition. The shock was over. What remained was a circle of composers guarding their achievement, like priests tending a dying flame. And yet, for Teddy, Vienna felt like a second home. He recognized something in its air, a profound melancholy, South German and Austrian in character, a tone he had first tasted during childhood summers in the village of Amorbach. The city wrapped around him. Berg himself was a revelation. Teddy would later describe his face as a mountain face, with abyss-like eyes, enigmatically empty, like lakes set into stone. He seemed to Teddy like a groping, dreaming giant, a man somehow not quite equal to his own size. There was a gentleness to Berg that contrasted sharply with the severity of his music. One afternoon, Berg took Teddy to the Café Imperial and spent hours teaching him how to write a legible score. It was a lesson in craft, delivered with patience and intimacy. Teddy, for his part, admitted he displayed a deadly seriousness that probably got on the nerves of a mature artist. He was earnest to a fault. Berg drew him into other intimacies as well. There was a secret love affair, conducted in letters and glances, between Berg and Hannah Fuchs-Robetin, the married sister of the writer Franz Werfel. Berg used Teddy as a clumsy intermediary, swearing him to silence about the whole thing. Teddy accepted the role. It made him feel he was living in a sphere of great passions, far removed from the provincial narrowness of Frankfurt. He was young and impressionable, and the drama of it thrilled him. He tried to approach Arnold Schoenberg, the master. It did not go well. Schoenberg's authority was awe-inspiring in a way that Teddy found uncanny. He perceived the older man as an intimidating figure who was at the same time something of an actor and a clown. The combination repelled him. He could not get close. In the orbit around Schoenberg, however, he met Hans Eisler. Eisler was only 5 years older than Teddy, but already recognized as the representative composer of the youngest generation. He treated the master with a rebellious insolence that impressed Teddy enormously. Eisler also served as a kind of guide to the radical left, introducing Teddy to a mélange of professional revolutionaries and coffeehouse radicals. Teddy felt both attracted and excluded by this conspiratorial world. He wanted to belong, but something in him held back. He frequented the Café Imperial and the circle around the satirist Karl Kraus, whose public performances subverted religious concepts of every kind. He met the philosopher Georg Lukács, who arrived not in ragged revolutionary garb, but in elegant clothes. This confused Teddy. He had expected a communist leader to look the part. Back in Frankfurt, his mentor Siegfried Kracauer received enthusiastic but coded letters about all of it, the secret affairs, the urbane social context of artists mingling with industrialists. Kracauer noted a dissembling in his younger friend. Teddy was moving in circles where he was entirely out of his depth emotionally, performing a sophistication he had not yet earned. He began to see things differently during this period. In conversations with the writer Soma Morgenstern, he started describing his own father, Oscar the wine merchant, as a socialist. It was a strange revision of his bourgeois origins, a distancing. At the same time, he relished his proximity to Helene Berg, who was rumored to be the emperor's illegitimate daughter. He was caught between worlds, repudiating one inheritance while collecting the glamour of another. The central lesson of Vienna, though, was harder than any of this. Teddy came to realize he could not survive as a composer of radical music. The new music was hermetically sealed off from the public. Eisler wanted to break this isolation by turning to the proletariat, writing songs for workers. Teddy rejected that simplification. He insisted on the autonomy of the artwork. But insisting on autonomy did not pay the rent. The market imposed a silence on the avant-garde, and Teddy could not escape that silence. The realization was traumatic. He had believed he could achieve something in music. He had not. He returned to Frankfurt, carrying everything Vienna had given him, the lessons from Berg, the image of Schoenberg's uncanny authority, the debates with Eisler about art and politics. the knowledge that the revolution in music had already ossified into history. The center of gravity was shifting anyway. Schoenberg was moving to Berlin, and in Germany, the ground was beginning to tremble under the weight of a different kind of radicalism entirely. Chapter 5. The Gathering Storm. Teddy came back to Frankfurt a changed man. He styled himself Dr. Wiesengrund Adorno now, hyphenating his father's Jewish surname with his mother's Corsican one. He showed up to carnival parties, dressed as Napoleon. He led what he called a dandified life, attending salons and concerts, wearing fine suits, cultivating the persona of a young intellectual on the rise. And all the while, he was writing at a pace that bordered on obsessive. The city hummed with tension in those years. The Weimar Republic was tearing itself apart. Unemployment soared. Street fights broke out between communists and fascists. And yet, in the lecture halls and cafes, in the pages of journals and the offices of the Institute for Social Research, a certain kind of intellectual life continued as if the ground weren't already shifting beneath it. Adorno completed his habilitation in 1931, writing on Kierkegaard. The book attacked inwardness, the existentialist retreat into the self, as a kind of escape from social reality. He began teaching as a hired lecturer, delivering lectures to small audiences in the university's corridors. He was brilliant, difficult, esoteric. Students found him either electrifying or impossible to follow, sometimes both. Max Horkheimer had taken over as director of the Institute for Social Research in 1930. Adorno drew closer to the circle, contributing to their journal. In 1932, he published his first programmatic essay for them, titled On the Social Situation of Music. It argued that music could not be understood apart from the society that produced it. Even the most abstract composition carried the scars of its historical moment. This was the method he would spend the rest of his life refining. He also wrote under a pseudonym, Hector Rottweiler. The name had a pugnacious ring to it, like a guard dog. Under this alias, he published critiques defending the boundary between serious art and kitsch. He believed that subversive comments could be scattered safely through articles, even as the political climate grew darker. The censors might miss what they couldn't quite understand. In late 1932, he composed a singspiel called The Treasure of Indian Joe, based on Mark Twain. He wrote both the libretto and the music. He described it to Alban Berg as having decent and fully matured music. The piece was an attempt to retreat into an image of childhood, a utopia of innocence, as a defense against the encroaching terror. Walter Benjamin saw through it immediately. He criticized the work for its reduction to the idyllic. The judgment wounded Adorno, who had been trying to salvage something gentle amidst the nightmare of the Republic's collapse. But the nightmare was accelerating. In January 1933, Hitler became Chancellor. By April, the law for the restoration of the professional civil service was enacted. Shortly after, Adorno's teaching license was revoked on the grounds of his non-Aryan descent. His academic career in Germany ended with a letter. He spent much of 1933 and 34 traveling between Germany and abroad, struggling to leave. He could not quite grasp that his status as the son of Oscar Wiesengrund, nephew of Aunt Agathe, offered no protection against the racial laws. The beautiful house on Seeheimer Strasse, the wine merchant's respectability, the singer's aura, the pianist's hands on the keys, none of it mattered to the state. Adorno and Horkheimer had engaged in what might be called an aesthetic left-wing radicalism. They underestimated the specific threat of National Socialism. They clung to the belief that the bourgeoisie would soon become fed up with Hitler. They assumed their status and wealth provided a buffer. They were wrong on every count. The protected, beautiful life disintegrated. The spirit of the Jewish businessman and the aura of the singer could not hold back the state-sanctioned theft and persecution. Adorno finally understood, in his bones now rather than just his mind, a maxim he would later make famous: there is no right life in the wrong one. This was not simply a philosophical observation. It was the concrete experience of watching the bourgeois facade crumble into absolute horror. The revocation stripped him of his professional identity. The visible dismantling of the legal and social structures that had supported his family forced him to accept what he had desperately tried to deny. There was no future for him in Germany. The idyllic retreat into childhood fantasies had been shattered by the state's decree. He would have to cross the physical and linguistic border, carrying the wounds of life across the Channel. He was heading for Oxford. Chapter 6. Oxford and the Grey Years. Teddy arrived in Oxford in 1934. He enrolled at Merton College as an advanced student. For a man who had already been lecturing at Frankfurt University, this was a demotion. He was 30 years old and back to square one, effectively a doctoral candidate again. The stone walls of the college were ancient and impressive. The damp got into everything. He called it the not very arduous preschool of exile. Britain offered safety, certainly, but intellectually he felt like he was suffocating. The English approach to philosophy struck him as relentlessly practical, concerned with common sense and observable facts. Where was the dialectic? Where was the contradiction? He wandered through a culture he found thoroughly commercialized, where even the phrase "English is spoken" rang in his ears like an advertising slogan. Everything felt transactional. Everything felt grey. He lived in what he called a state of reduced life. Occasionally, he would travel back to Germany. These trips were to see Gretel Karplus, his fiancée, and to bring his parents foreign currency they desperately needed. Each journey carried risk. The Nazis controlled the borders. Now, Adorno confessed privately that he feared being gassed if another war broke out. He made the crossings anyway, then returned to the quiet of Oxford, where nobody seemed to understand what was happening on the continent. The pressure to conform was constant, and he felt it acutely. He once wrote that anyone who speaks his own language passionately is unable to speak a foreign one. His German was precise, layered, demanding. English required a different kind of mind. He felt crippled. He felt unheard. "No one understands him anymore," he wrote, "and you sense the loneliness threaded through the words." He kept working. In 1936, he published an essay called On Jazz under the pseudonym Hector Rottweiler that he'd coined earlier. The essay was deadly serious. He refused to hear jazz as American vitality or democratic expression. To him, it was Gebrauchsmusik, utility music, the soundtrack of bourgeois leisure. He saw in its rhythms an aesthetic capitulation, the individual bending to the beat of the market. It was a harsh reading. Many have disagreed with it since, but Adorno never softened his view. His lifeline during these years was correspondence. Letters flew between Oxford, New York, and Paris. Horkheimer was in America now, rebuilding the Institute for Social Research on foreign soil. Benjamin remained in Europe, wandering, producing brilliant fragments, growing more desperate by the month. Adorno clung to these exchanges. They formed what he called an imagined community, a way of bridging the inability to relate that exile imposed on everyone it touched. The three of them were scattered across an ocean and a continent, but they kept thinking together, kept arguing, kept each other intellectually alive. Then came the losses. On Christmas Eve, 1935, Alban Berg died in Vienna. Adorno received the news and felt the ground shift beneath him. Berg had been his teacher, his model of what a composer could be. He wrote that long years have been torn out of their lives, meaning those who survived. The continuity of his own existence, he said, had been disrupted by catastrophes. It was a word he would use again and again in the years to come. That same year, his Aunt Agathe died. She was the woman who had played four-handed piano with him as a child, who had helped create that musical hothouse in Frankfurt. He called her his second mother. Her death severed something essential. The utopia of childhood was now truly gone. He confessed to Horkheimer that his entire private existence has fundamentally changed. He admitted to feeling paralyzed. Melancholy and loneliness pressed down on him. His work, he said, had become a drug, something to help him endure the unbearable fact of being safe while the world burned. He was out of the firing line, yes, but he was also spiritually destroyed. He kept writing anyway. In Oxford, he worked on a critique of Husserl, fighting to maintain what he called his intellectual self-discipline. The result would eventually become against epistemology. He needed the work. Without it, he might have simply stopped. At one point, he even toyed with the idea of writing hit tunes to earn money. He described an itching in one's fingertips to give in, to produce something the market wanted. But he pulled back. He knew that no composer can satisfy his own standards while working for commercial success. The compromise would have cost him everything he believed in. So he stayed poor. He stayed obscure. He stayed himself. Oxford had given him physical safety, but little else. The hothouse plant, as he had been called, found the English climate inhospitable in every sense. The damp, the polite indifference, the academic culture that seemed to demand he liquidate everything private and particular about himself. He was being deprovincialized, but only by force of his own isolation. His gaze turned increasingly westward, toward America, toward Horkheimer, toward what he called the most advanced observation post of the 20th century. To survive as a thinker, he would have to leave the old world behind entirely. Chapter 7. New York and the Radio Project. Adorno arrived in New York in 1938. He stepped off the boat into what he would later call a radically bourgeois country, a place where the cultivated European intellectual simply could not exist in the old sense. There was no reverential silence for the life of the mind here. The city hummed with commerce, with urgency, with the relentless forward motion of a society that measured worth in output. He joined the Institute for Social Research, now housed at Columbia University, but his financial survival depended on something else entirely. A part-time position with Paul Lazarsfeld's Princeton Radio Research Project. The headquarters were not in some grand academic hall. They were in an abandoned brewery in Newark, New Jersey. The setting could not have been more apt. Here, in a building that once produced drink for the masses, Adorno would begin theorizing the industrialization of culture itself. Lazarsfeld was a peculiar figure, a Marxist on leave, as one observer put it. He operated with an entrepreneurial energy that was completely foreign to Adorno. The goal of the project was straightforward enough. Measure how audiences responded to radio music, use questionnaires, gather data, apply what Lazarsfeld called administrative research methods, find out what people liked and why, and how to give them more of it. Adorno clashed with this approach almost immediately. When Lazarsfeld wanted to know how people listened, Adorno insisted on asking a different question. What were they listening to? He argued that the music itself, standardized and mass-produced, predetermined the listener's reaction before any questionnaire could be filled out. The problem was not in the measurement. The problem was in the product. He approached the sociology of music more as a musician than as a sociologist. He refused to treat symphonies and popular songs as mere stimuli for testing consumer behavior. Radio, he observed, encouraged a particular kind of listening. Atomistic, he called it. Listeners waited for the hit melody, the recognizable hook, rather than engaging with the structure of a piece as a whole. He termed this regressive listening a concept he developed in his essay on the fetish character in music. The ear had been trained to want fragments. The whole had become unbearable. The competitive atmosphere of American academia pressed down on him. Jewish scholars faced immense pressure to adapt, to prove themselves useful in terms the market could understand. Adorno wrote to Horkheimer about the repugnant nature of working with Lazarsfeld. He feared the work contributed nothing to what he called his dianoetic virtue, his capacity for genuine thought. He felt himself becoming a research technician, a cog in a machine designed to make capitalism run more smoothly. And yet something was happening to him. Despite the friction, despite the humiliation, he was learning to see culture from the outside. He called it a deprovincialization. The naive belief in culture he had maintained in Europe, the faith that high art existed in some protected sphere above the market, was shattering. He encountered the culture industry not as a theory to be developed, but as a daily practice. The hustle of New York made it visible. The possibility of becoming an economic subject, an entrepreneur, a proprietor, had been entirely liquidated. All had become employees. He and Horkheimer communicated in what they called the slave language of the exiles, coded phrases, careful formulations. They masked their Marxist orientation when navigating the bureaucracy of the Rockefeller Foundation and other funding bodies. Survival required discretion. During these years, Adorno frequented Harlem. He danced at the Savoy Ballroom. He gained a detailed first-hand knowledge of American jazz that would later contradict his reputation for ignorance on the subject. He knew the music. He had moved his body to it, but he rejected it theoretically all the same, viewing it as pseudo-individualization, a false freedom offered by the culture machine. By 1941, his contract with the radio project ended. Financial ruin loomed. He wrote desperately to Horkheimer, half seriously suggesting they all retrain as psychoanalysts to survive. It was a low point. The fragility of the intellectual in a market society had never been more apparent to him. The abandoned brewery in Newark and the statistical machinery of the radio project had given Adorno a brutal education in the mechanics of mass culture. But the noise of the metropolis and the demands of administrative research left no space for the main task of philosophy. New York offered survival, but not concentration. Horkheimer had already fled the frantic pace of the East Coast for the seclusion of the Pacific. With his finances collapsing and his patience for measuring culture exhausted, Adorno knew that to save his work, he had to follow his friend to the edge of the continent. Chapter 8. California and the Dialectic. In 1941, Teddy moved to Los Angeles. He settled in the Pacific Palisades, that strip of coastal California where the mountains slope down toward the ocean and the light has a quality you don't find anywhere else on earth. Bougainvillea climbed the fences. Hummingbirds hovered at the feeders. The air smelled of eucalyptus and salt. It was, by any reasonable measure, paradise. And every morning, the newspapers arrived with fresh reports of genocide. This was the peculiar torture of exile in California. Adorno would sit on his terrace, surrounded by flowers, while the radio delivered news of mass deportations, of ghettos liquidated, of a continent in flames. The disconnect was almost unbearable. He described it later as living in a kind of dream, where the beauty of the surroundings made the horror seem even more abstract, even more impossible to grasp. The Pacific Ocean glittered. Somewhere across it, and then across another ocean entirely, people were being loaded onto trains. He was not alone in this strange purgatory. A whole colony of German exiles had washed up on these shores. Horkheimer was there, of course, along with Friedrich Pollock. Bertolt Brecht lived nearby, as did the composer Hans Eisler. Thomas Mann held court in his own Pacific Palisades villa. They called it German California, this little archipelago of refugee intellectuals scattered across the canyons and beachfront properties of greater Los Angeles. They visited each other constantly. They argued. They gossiped. They drank. The arguments could turn vicious. Brecht, in particular, had little patience for what he considered Adorno's Mandarin abstractions. He called him a TUI, an acronym from one of his plays that stood for Intellectual for Hire. In his journals, Brecht described these conversations with a mixture of grudging respect and contempt. These unfortunate intellectuals, he wrote, are they dangerous? They are dangerous, like cigars cut up in the soup. It was not a compliment. Adorno gave as good as he got. He found Brecht's politics crude, his Marxism mechanical, his faith in the working class naive, bordering on delusional. In 1942, they held a seminar on human needs at Adorno's house. Brecht and Herbert Marcuse attended. The discussion collapsed into acrimony almost immediately. What people needed, how those needs were shaped by capitalism, whether authentic needs could even exist under conditions of total administration, none of them could agree on any of it. The fractures within the exiled left were on full display. But it was with Horkheimer that Adorno did his most important work. They had begun writing together, dictating their thoughts to Gretel while she typed. The manuscript grew in fragments, pieces of analysis and aphorism that circled around a single devastating question. Why was humanity sinking into barbarism? The Enlightenment was supposed to liberate people from superstition and tyranny. Reason was supposed to set them free. Instead, reason had produced the assembly line and the concentration camp. Something had gone terribly wrong. They called the book Dialectic of Enlightenment. It was completed in 1944, though completed is perhaps the wrong word. The book ends with the phrase, "to be continued," a signal that the authors considered their work unfinished, perhaps unfinishable. The whole is the false, Adorno had written elsewhere. Systematic philosophy was impossible after Auschwitz. Only fragments remained. One of those fragments would prove especially influential. Adorno and Horkheimer coined a term for what they saw happening all around them in Hollywood: the culture industry. This was not art. This was not entertainment in any meaningful sense. This was a system of mass deception, a machinery that standardized human experience and turned individuals into passive consumers. The movies, the radio programs, the magazines, all of it worked to flatten difference, to absorb resistance, to make people comfortable with their own domination. The culture industry did not repress desire. It managed desire. It told you what to want and then sold it back to you. Adorno observed this machinery up close. He attended parties in Malibu, rubbing shoulders with what he called the movie mob. At one gathering, he shook hands with an actor and felt cold metal, an artificial iron hand, some kind of prop or prosthetic. Charlie Chaplin was standing nearby. The comedian instantly mimicked Adorno's shocked expression, his face contorting into a perfect replica of horror. Everyone laughed. Adorno laughed too, though he later analyzed the moment obsessively. Comedy and barbarism, he decided, were closer than anyone wanted to admit. There was another party, this one on the beach. Hans Eisler had been drinking heavily. At some point in the evening, he slumped against someone and muttered in German, "Mir ist so mies. I feel so lousy." It became a kind of joke among them, a catchphrase for the whole exile experience. And it gave rise to a metaphor that would define their intellectual project. They were writing messages in bottles. Their theories had no audience, no constituency, no practical application in the present moment. The working class had failed them. The culture had been captured. All they could do was seal their thoughts in glass and throw them into the ocean, hoping that someday, somewhere, an unknown reader might fish them out. In 1943, Adorno made a decision that pained him for the rest of his life. He officially changed his name. Wiesengrund, his father's name, sounded too Jewish, even in America. In the xenophobic climate of wartime America, that was a liability. So he took his mother's maiden name instead, Theodor Adorno. It was a survival strategy, nothing more. But it felt like a betrayal, a shedding of his father's lineage that he could never quite forgive himself for. The war ground on. The news from Europe grew worse before it grew better. Adorno kept writing. He collaborated with Eisler on a book about film music, analyzing how Hollywood scores functioned as a kind of emotional cement, gluing together the fragmented images on screen and telling audiences what to feel. He developed a theory of rackets, arguing that the world economy was not a free market, but a system of mafia-like protection gangs, each defending its territory through violence and coercion. He saw this pattern everywhere, in capitalism, in fascism, in the persecution of the Jews. And through it all, the California sun kept shining, the flowers kept blooming, the ocean kept glittering under that impossible light. Adorno had fled to paradise, and paradise had turned out to be a documentary film about the end of the world, one in which he and everyone he knew had been reduced to walk-on parts. He watched, he took notes, he waited for the bottle to wash ashore. Chapter 9. The Devil's Composer. Thomas Mann had a problem. He was writing what he hoped would be his masterpiece, a novel called Dr. Faustus, and at its center was a composer. Adrian Leverkühn, the protagonist, was a man who contracts syphilis in exchange for a breakthrough in artistic genius, a pact with the devil, paid for in flesh. Mann could write the prose. He could build the architecture of tragedy, but he couldn't write the music. He needed someone who understood the technical details, the theory, the sound of notes on a page. He admitted it openly. He lacked the scholarship, and so he turned to his neighbor in Pacific Palisades, to Teddy, the philosopher who had once dreamed of being a composer himself. Adorno became Mann's unofficial consultant, his privy councillor, as some later put it. He handed over the manuscript of his Philosophy of Modern Music. He gave Mann his essay on Beethoven's late style. Mann read them, absorbed them, and then wove them directly into the novel. Sometimes the borrowing was close enough to be called verbatim. Adorno was becoming a co-author, though his name would never appear on the cover. One afternoon, Adorno sat down at the piano and played Beethoven's Sonata Opus 111 for Mann. He talked as he played, lecturing on the Arietta theme, its strange withdrawals and returns, its refusal to resolve neatly. Mann listened, took notes, and later transcribed the entire scene into the novel. It became the lecture delivered by the character Wendell Kretschmar. Mann even slipped Adorno's paternal name, Wiesengrund, into the text. as a hidden acknowledgement. The descriptions of Leverkusen's fictional compositions came straight from Adorno's analysis of the 12-tone technique. Schoenberg's rigorous, mathematical method of composing was transformed in the novel into something darker. It became a symbol of the pact itself. The system that liberated music from tonality was recast as the price of a bargain with destruction. The apocalypsis cum figuris, Leverkusen's apocalyptic oratorio, was Adorno's musicology dressed in narrative clothes. The collaboration had moments of genuine warmth. When Mahn read aloud the chapter describing the devil's appearance, Adorno was deeply moved. He told Mahn he could listen to him the whole night long. For Adorno, this was something close to utopia. Here was the German literary tradition, embodied in Mahn, engaging seriously with his ideas. The exile community had produced something lasting. But complications arrived, as they tend to. Arnold Schoenberg lived nearby, and when he learned that his 12-tone method had been used in the novel without credit, attributed to a character who had contracted syphilis for his genius, he was furious. He accused Adorno of being an informer, someone who had leaked trade secrets to an outsider. Schoenberg even invented a verb. To Adorno, he said, meant to betray. Mahn grew nervous. He worried about his artistic illusion, the idea that readers might think he had invented the musical theory himself. He began to minimize Adorno's contribution in public. In his diary, he wrote about the need to reassure Adorno, whose awareness of his own musical part ownership was, as Mahn put it, seething. Adorno felt the tension. He was proud to see his theoretical work realized in a major novel, proud that his ideas about the aging of the new and the crisis of modern art had found such a prominent vehicle. But he also felt used. Mahn's later letters revealed a certain calculation. He had drawn on Adorno's intellect while keeping a careful distance from Adorno, the person. Years later, Mahn published The Story of a Novel, his account of how Dr. Faustus came to be. He described Adorno as a man of tragically clever and exclusive spirit, and linked him to Walter Benjamin. He called Adorno my man. The words were generous, in their way, but they carried an air of patrician distance, the tone of a master acknowledging a useful servant. For Adorno, something else was happening beneath the surface of this collaboration. Leverkusen represented a kind of ghost. The character embodied the creative destiny Adorno had once imagined for himself, the life of a composer rather than a critic. By feeding his musical philosophy into Mahn's creation, Adorno was living out that ambition vicariously. The novel became a palimpsest. Underneath Mahn's narrative lay Adorno's radical critique of modern culture, his analysis of how the new had grown old, how the promise of artistic liberation had curdled into something closer to barbarism. The war was ending now. The camps were being liberated. The full scale of what had happened was becoming known. The era of messages in bottles, of theoretical work written for an unknown future, was drawing to a close. Adorno had injected his philosophy into the bloodstream of world literature, but he remained in the shadows, the man who understood the secrets of the catastrophe, but stood behind the great names. He would need to speak in his own voice soon, to assemble his fragmented reflections on damaged life into something that carried his name alone. Chapter 10. Minima Moralia. Adorno began assembling aphorisms in 1944, short pieces, fragments, each one a small, sharp observation about the texture of daily life. He gathered the first 50 of them and presented them to Horkheimer on his 50th birthday, February 14th, 1945. It was a gift, but also a promise, a declaration that their shared philosophy could survive the wreckage of the era. He called the work Minima Moralia and gave it a subtitle, Reflections from Damaged Life. The phrase came from Ferdinand Kernberger. Life does not live. Adorno placed it at the opening like an epigraph carved into stone. He was writing from the narrowest possible vantage point, that of the intellectual in emigration, and he made no apologies for it. The whole is the false, he argued. Hegel had been wrong. There was no grand totality moving toward reconciliation. There was only breakage. The text carried within it what he called the Jewish awareness of the permanence of threat and catastrophe. News had reached California, the camps, the scale of what had happened. Adorno understood that in those places the boundary between life and death had been erased entirely. This knowledge saturated everything he wrote. It pressed against the sentences like water against a dam. He reflected on his own childhood, the hothouse plant, the early maturer who had been shielded from the crude violence of the world by imagination and maternal protection. Eventually, he wrote, such a person is forced to catch himself up. The softness of the sheltered life gives way. Reality arrives anyway. He turned his attention to physical objects, door handles, windows, the design of modern dwellings. He noticed how houses no longer belonged to human habitation in the old sense. They had become extensions of garages, built to be discarded like old food cans. The bombing of European cities had sharpened this perception. Homes were disposable. Lives were disposable. The architecture of the present had already accommodated this truth. In one aphorism, titled Refuge for the Homeless, he wrote a sentence that would follow him for the rest of his life. Wrong life cannot be lived rightly. It emerged from the guilt of survival. Those who had remained in Germany, those who had not escaped, had been wiped out. And here he was, in California, analyzing door handles, breathing easily, writing. Yet memory persisted. In a piece called Heliotrope, he recalled the happiness of childhood travel. The suitcases with their hotel labels from Souvretta and Madonna di Campiglio. He compared them to the treasure chests of Aladdin and Ali Baba, vessels carrying jewels from one place to another. The exile remembered what arrival had once felt like. He began to attack what he called the jargon of authenticity, the new need for religion. These were attempts to manufacture false security in a world where the individual had become a thing that twitches impotently. He saw through the consolations on offer. The text included what he described as a grimly comic riddle. Where is the proletariat? The workers' movement had decayed, the working class had been integrated into the system of consumption. Revolution had stalled. He yearned for his friends. He used animal names in letters to maintain a private human sphere against the coldness of the administered world. Fritz Lang was the badger. Horkheimer was the hippopotamus, King Archibald. These names were shields, small acts of warmth preserved against the ice. He dreamed of a utopia, doing nothing like an animal, lying on water and looking peacefully at the sky. It was a radical rejection of production as an end in itself, the logic that governed both capitalism and Soviet communism. Rest, stillness, the absence of purpose. Writing was his drug. He admitted this plainly. It helped him overcome what would otherwise be an almost unbearable melancholy and loneliness. It was the only means to maintain intellectual self-discipline in the face of dissolution. The message in the bottle had been sealed in the California sun, a private testament to a civilization in ruins. But the isolation of the Grand Hotel Abyss was about to end. The imaginary witness Adorno wrote for was suddenly replaced by a tangible opportunity. The night of fascism had technically lifted, leaving behind a landscape of physical and moral rubble. Horkheimer had gone ahead to scout the territory, and his letters spoke of a country that was more vigorous and zestful and evil than ever. Adorno had to decide whether to remain a small rentier in California or step back into the graveyard of his childhood. Chapter 11. The Return to the Scene of the Crime. Teddy arrived in Frankfurt am Main on the 2nd of November, 1949. The destruction of the city had been virtually complete, and yet, strangely, the social and economic damage was almost nowhere to be seen. Rubble had been cleared, trams were running. People went about their business as though the previous decade had been a bad dream from which everyone had now woken, refreshed and ready to rebuild. He gave his first seminar shortly after arriving. He described it as uncanny. In a letter to his old friend Leo Lowenthal, he wrote that it felt like a Talmud school, as if the ghosts of the murdered Jewish intellectuals had entered the German students. These young people, sitting in rows before him, were not the ones who had done the murdering. They were too young for that. But they were the children of that generation, raised in the rubble of a catastrophe their parents refused to discuss. For the next 4 years, Teddy commuted between Frankfurt and Santa Monica. He was torn. Germany offered the security of a tenure-track position. California offered what he called paradisal conditions. He confessed to Horkheimer that every glass of kirsch in the Schlagbaum had more in common with their philosophy than David Riesman's collected works. The comment was only half a joke. He missed Europe in his bones, even this shattered, amnesiac version of it. Horkheimer had returned earlier, in 1948, and his reports were grim. The Germans, he warned, were seemingly unaffected by everything that had happened. The earlier modes of thought were still all there, ossified, mummy-like. The bodies had been buried, the trials had concluded, but the thinking that had produced the horror remained, like furniture under dust sheets in an abandoned house. Together, they re-established the Institute for Social Research. The new building stood on the Senckenberg Anlage, a modernist structure designed to signal a break with the neo-Baroque past of the university. Glass and clean lines instead of columns and ornamentation. The message was clear enough. But there was a problem. The director's offices were separated from the main university by a busy thoroughfare. Teddy demanded that the city install a set of traffic lights for the safety of pedestrians. The request sparked debates in the local and national press about the so-called Adorno lights. The philosopher who had dissected the culture industry, who had traced the roots of fascism to the very structure of Western reason, was now cast in the role of a traffic regulator. The Institute launched a study called the Group Experiment. The aim was to gauge what they termed non-public opinion. In formal settings, Germans said the right things. They expressed support for democracy, condemned the Nazi regime, spoke the language of the new order, but in less guarded moments. In the transcripts of group discussions, something else emerged. Beneath the democratic surface, banknotes of a second currency circulated, deep-seated resentment, Nazi apologetics, a refusal to accept responsibility. The study confirmed what Teddy had suspected. The past had not been processed. It had simply been buried, and not very deep. He encountered a student who assured him, quite sincerely, that we Germans have never taken anti-Semitism seriously. Teddy had to remind him of Auschwitz. The student was not being malicious. That was almost worse. He genuinely believed what he was saying. The mechanisms of forgetting were already at work, smoothing over the rupture, making the unthinkable seem like an aberration rather than a culmination. Teddy moved into an apartment at Kettenhofweg 123 in the West End. He tried to resume an upper-middle-class existence, but he noted, years later, that it was not possible to take pleasure in any single old nook and cranny without feeling ashamed and without feeling guilty. The reconstruction of bombed buildings bothered him especially. In Würzburg, they had faithfully rebuilt an old inn called Zum Volken, every ornamental detail restored. Teddy saw this as an injustice to everything that was lovable about the past. The reconstruction denied the historical rupture. It pretended that continuity was possible when it was not. Still, he felt a seductive pull from the German intellectual climate. Only in Germany, he believed, was there a resonance for his work. European culture offered a reverential silence that America could not match. In America, everything was scientific experience, empirical data, questionnaires. Here, philosophy still meant something. People still argued about Hegel in cafes. In 1953, he finally abandoned his American residency. He had grown tired of what he called the social Darwinist world of American academic hustling. He wanted to gain time to think and to live. And the two things, he insisted, were identical. He justified the move with an old rule: the refugee goes back to see what he can accomplish. He wanted to transmit a tradition of anti-traditionalism to a new generation. Critical thinking, the refusal to accept things as they were, the demand to look at what everyone else preferred to ignore. He had secured his place in what he would later call the House of the Hangman. He had exchanged the isolation of the Pacific Palisades for the uncanny familiarity of the Frankfurt Lecture Hall. He had re-entered the German language, the only home left to him. But holding a chair at the university was not enough. The silence regarding the past was deafening. The restoration of Germany was proceeding with terrifying efficiency, cementing over the cracks of history with economic success. To break this universal lie, Teddy would need to step out of the seminar room and into the public sphere. Chapter 12. The Public Interventions. In the Federal Republic, Adorno became something he had never quite been before. A public figure. Not a celebrity in the American sense, but something stranger and more German. A voice on the radio. A presence in the newspapers. A man whose sentences could start arguments in living rooms across the country. He did not look the part. The German professoriate had its costumes, its rituals, its stiff collars and formal bearing. Adorno walked into lecture halls wearing a windbreaker. It was a small thing, but small things mattered in a country desperate to restore the old forms. He brought a different atmosphere with him, less ceremony, more urgency. The radio became his instrument. In America, the airwaves belonged to advertisers, to soap operas, to the machinery of commerce. But German broadcasting in those years had a provincial quality that Adorno recognized as an opportunity. Complex philosophical ideas could travel through the static and into kitchens, into bedrooms, into the minds of people who would never set foot in a university seminar. He gave talks on education, on music, on the meaning of the past. He spoke directly to a generation that needed to learn how to think again. And there was the sentence, the one that would follow him for the rest of his life and beyond. He had written it in 1949 in an essay called Cultural Criticism and Society. It appeared again in his collection Prisms in 1955. To write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric, and this corrodes even the knowledge of why it has become impossible to write poetry today. The words were endlessly quoted, endlessly misunderstood. People took them as a prohibition, a ban on art. There was something else entirely, a demand. Culture could not simply continue as though nothing had happened. The old forms, the old comforts, the old ways of making meaning had been implicated in the catastrophe. To carry on with business as usual was its own kind of barbarism. He disliked the title Prisms, incidentally. He found it conformist, distinctive in a way that cost nothing, a concession to the marketplace. But the book established him as a cultural critic of the first rank, someone whose judgments carried weight in the newspapers and the feuilleton sections. The public disputes followed. Peter Hofstetter, a psychologist, attacked the group experiment for expecting Germans to shoulder the burden of Auschwitz's horrors. Adorno's response was precise and cold. It was the victims of Auschwitz who were compelled to shoulder the burden, he wrote, not those people who do not wish to know about them. He attacked the philosophers too. The existentialism that had swept through post-war Germany struck him as evasion dressed up as profundity. He dismantled what he'd previously coined the jargon of authenticity, the vocabulary of Heidegger and his followers. It was warmed-over mysticism, he argued. A ghost of a ghost. The language sounded deep but meant nothing. It masked social reality with pseudo-religious terminology, offering people the feeling of meaning without the substance. In 1959, he delivered an essay called The Meaning of Working Through the Past. His diagnosis was unsettling. The survival of National Socialism within democracy, he argued, was more dangerous than fascist tendencies operating against democracy from outside. The country had not mastered its past. It had suppressed it. The silence of the Adenauer era was not healing. It was a wound that refused to close because no one would look at it. He maintained a certain coldness in his public manner, a conventional formality that kept people at a distance. He believed that emotional strength required a kind of prickliness. The non-reified consciousness, he said, appears cold. It was a defense against the false intimacy of the era, the easy friendliness that covered over the chasms of guilt and complicity. Behind all of this lay what he called the new categorical imperative, a moral absolute that separated him from conservatives and communists alike. Arrange your thoughts and actions so that Auschwitz will not repeat itself. This was the standard against which everything else had to be measured. Philosophy, art, education, politics, all of it filtered through that single demand. He had become a moral authority in a country that did not want one, a voice that refused to let the past stay buried. Chapter 13. The Musicologist. Adorno returned to Germany with his reputation secured, yet something gnawed at him. He confessed to the conductor René Leibowitz that he viewed his own failure to continue composing as a trauma. Biographical destiny, he called it. Psychological mechanisms. Whatever the words, the wound was clear. He had not achieved what he could have as a composer. The critic who dissected music with such precision had once dreamed of creating it. His book, The Philosophy of Modern Music, appeared in 1949. He described it as an excursus to the dialectic of enlightenment, a footnote to the larger project. At first, it reached only a small, esoteric circle of readers. But within that circle, it established something important. Here was a thinker who refused to soften his analysis, who treated the new music with the seriousness it deserved and the rigor it demanded. From 1950 onwards, he became a central figure at the international vacation courses on new music in Darmstadt. The town of Kranichstein hosted composers and theorists from across Europe, all wrestling with what music could mean after the catastrophe. Adorno brought his friends Eduard Steuermann and Rudolf Kolisch into this world. An atmosphere developed where solidarity flourished even in the midst of violent disagreements. People argued fiercely about 12-tone technique, about form and freedom, about the responsibilities of the artist. Then they ate dinner together. He championed a concept he called musique informelle, music free from rigid systems, music that refused the tyranny of total organization while also rejecting the false comforts of the old tonality. He dedicated the idea to Wolfgang Steinecker, praising the man's civic courage to issue manifestos. The avant-garde tradition demanded such courage. Someone had to say what others found too dangerous or too difficult to articulate. Yet Adorno saw trouble brewing within the avant-garde itself. He launched a fierce critique of what he called the aging of the new, the shock value that had once made movements like surrealism so vital had been deadened by repetition. What defamiliarized audiences in the 1920s had become by the 50s and 60s, the ghost of a ghost. The culture industry absorbed transgression. It packaged rebellion and sold it back to consumers who no longer flinched. His essays on jazz remained especially controversial. In Prisms, published in 1955, he reissued pieces like Perennial Fashion Jazz. Critics hoped his time in America had softened his view. It hadn't. In Prisms, he doubled down. He argued again that jazz offered only pseudo-rebellion. When Joachim Behrendt claimed jazz was original, Adorno attacked him with the full weight of his American experience. The improvisation was cosmetic. The form was fixed. Gustav Mahler occupied a different place in his thinking entirely. Adorno interpreted Mahler's music as a musical physiognomy, a kind of portrait rendered in sound. He heard in those symphonies the Jewish prohibition on making graven images, extended now to include hope itself. The music gesticulates, he wrote. It raises a shriek of horror at something worse than death. Mahler's convulsive gestures, the harsh alternation of major and minor, finally released the truth of Heinrich Heine's poetry, the vision of victimhood, the sense of homelessness. No composer of Heine's own generation had managed to capture it. Mahler, decades later, found the form. Adorno understood that the composing subject was never purely individual. Every sound says we, he observed. The collective speaks through the composer's hands. Yet the new music pressed forward toward an absolute identity that aspired to voice the non-identical, the particular, the remainder, what refused to be absorbed. By the late 60s, he noticed something shifting in America, a very vigorous and spontaneous resistance to the culture industry had emerged in the music scene. He cited John Cage and his school specifically. This was an acknowledgement, however qualified, that the standardized culture he had critiqued in the 40s was facing new challenges. The situation was not static. And yet, despite his theoretical dominance, despite the lectures and the essays and the influence over younger composers, something continued to haunt him. He knew that no composer could satisfy his own standards while working for the market. The itch remained, the resistance held, but the tension never fully resolved. Chapter 14. Negative Dialectics. By 1966, Adorno had been circling the same problem for decades. How do you think after Auschwitz? How do you write philosophy when philosophy itself had failed to prevent the catastrophe? He had been gathering fragments, testing ideas in lectures, arguing with colleagues. Now, he sat down to write the book he believed he had been born to produce. He described Negative Dialectics to his friend Ernst Bloch as the work for which I truly exist. Everything else had been preparation. The essays, the radio talks, the dense pages on music and culture, all of it pointed toward this single, impossible task. He wanted to break what he called the spell of eternal sameness. He wanted to shatter the habit of thought that stuffed the messy, bleeding world into tidy conceptual boxes. The problem, as Adorno saw it, was identity thinking. Western philosophy had spent centuries trying to make reality fit its categories. If something didn't match the concept, so much the worse for reality. The thing that resisted classification was ignored, suppressed, or destroyed. And this wasn't merely an academic failing. The urge to make everything the same, to eliminate what didn't belong, had found its ultimate expression in the camps. The logic of the system had become the logic of extermination. Adorno's response was to insist on the non-identical, the remainder, the thing that slips through the net. He argued that freedom itself depended on acknowledging what refused to be absorbed. To think properly meant thinking against your own categories. It meant staying in the contradiction rather than resolving it. There would be no final synthesis, no triumphant arrival at truth, only the constant, exhausting work of keeping thought honest. He formulated what he called a new categorical imperative for the age. Kant had told people to act as though the principle of their action could become universal law. Adorno revised this for a world after the Holocaust. He returned to the imperative he had formulated years earlier, that mankind must arrange its thoughts so that Auschwitz never repeats. This wasn't a positive program. It was a prohibition, a minimum standard, the floor below which humanity must never again fall. He wrote that after Auschwitz, our feelings resist any claim of the positivity of existence as sanctimonious prattle. The old consolations no longer worked. You couldn't talk about meaning or purpose or the march of progress without obscuring what had happened. The guilt of a life which purely as a fact will strangle other life, he wrote, is irreconcilable with living. This was not comfortable philosophy. It offered no reconciliation, no healing. It demanded that you sit with the wound. Around this time, Adorno published an open letter in Die Zeit for Max Horkheimer's 70th birthday. The two men had been intellectual partners for over 4 decades. They had written Dialectic of Enlightenment together in California, watching the news from Europe grow darker by the month. Now Horkheimer lived in Montagnola in the Swiss-Italian mountains, while Adorno remained in Frankfurt. They kept up what Adorno called a subterranean conversation, letters and visits across the years. In the birthday letter, Adorno made a confession that revealed something about their long friendship. "You think human beings are like animals," he wrote to Horkheimer. "I think that animals are like humans." It was a small distinction, but it mattered. Horkheimer saw cruelty as the defining feature of the species. Adorno saw suffering as the link between all creatures. Philosophy, he would later write, actually exists in order to redeem what is to be found in the gaze of an animal. All his high theory, all his dense abstractions, came back to something simpler, the mute appeal of the creature that cannot speak its pain. He credited Horkheimer with saving him from the life of an aesthete. Without his friend's influence, Adorno might have remained a brilliant critic of music, comfortable in the salon, insulated from politics. Horkheimer had taught him that everything connected, that the symphony and the stock exchange and the concentration camp were part of the same social totality. Their experiences did not run in parallel, Adorno admitted, but they converged. Not everyone received such generous treatment. Adorno's relationship with Ernst Bloch had soured badly. Bloch's massive work, The Principle of Hope, celebrated utopian longing, the human capacity to imagine a better world. Adorno found this insufferable. He accused Bloch of glossing over the historical wound of failed emancipation. All that talk of hope and possibility seemed to him like a betrayal of the dead. Bloch, he wrote in his diary, is the greatest living Bloch actor, already dead, but has not yet realized it. Negative Dialectics appeared in 1966. It was dense and difficult. Sentences that coiled back on themselves. Paragraphs that refused to yield their meaning easily. Adorno presented the book not as a completed system, but as what he called a theory of intellectual experience. He was trying to think at the same time dialectically and undialectically. The phrase came from Walter Benjamin, dead now for over 25 years, but still present in everything Adorno wrote. Benjamin's ghost moved through the pages, demanding fidelity to a way of seeing that couldn't be systematized. Adorno reflected on his own strange development. He had been a child prodigy, playing piano duets before he could read properly, reciting poems for his mother's friends. But he considered himself a late developer too. His actual achievement, he felt, still lay somewhere ahead. He was 63 years old. He had written dozens of books and hundreds of essays, and yet the real work always seemed to hover just out of reach. In the next manuscript, the next lecture, the book that would finally say what needed to be said. The fortress of thought he had built was formidable. Every concept examined for complicity, every system suspected of violence. The identity thinking that led to the camps would find no purchase here. But philosophy, however vigilant, remained philosophy. It happened in books, in seminars, behind closed doors. Adorno had spent his life as what he called an imaginary witness, writing messages in bottles and casting them into the sea. He could not have known that a generation of students was about to wash up on his shore, clutching those bottles and demanding something he had never promised: action. Chapter 15. The Collision and the End. The students came for him with his own ideas. They had read his books, attended his lectures, absorbed his critique of the administered world. Now they wanted action. Direct, immediate, political action. Adorno watched the movement swell through Frankfurt in the late 1960s and saw something troubling beneath the passion. He called it pseudo-activity, a performance of resistance that masked its own powerlessness. The young radicals had a name for themselves, borrowed from his old friend and rival. They were the Marcuse Jugend, the Marcuse Youth, and they considered Adorno a reactionary. The accusations stung. He wrote to Samuel Beckett in February 1969, admitting that being targeted by students who claimed to follow his philosophy came as something of a surprise. He had spent decades teaching them to think against the grain. He had not anticipated they would turn that thinking against him. Among the student leaders was Hans-Jürgen Krahl. Adorno recognized his talent immediately. Krahl had been one of his students for years, unquestionably one of the most gifted minds in the movement. But Adorno also diagnosed something darker in the young man. A pathological divided identity, he called it. The split showed itself in strange moments. Krahl would shout slogans through a megaphone at demonstrations, his voice amplified and aggressive. Then he would approach Adorno privately and whisper an apology. "I hope you won't take it amiss," he said. It was purely political, not meant personally. The personal and the political had become impossible to separate. The students occupied the Institute for Social Research, the intellectual home Adorno and Horkheimer had rebuilt from the ruins of exile. They sat in the offices where critical theory had been written, demanding that theory become practice. Adorno called the police. It was the only way to defend their authority in the building, he explained. The decision solidified the breach. The theorist of liberation had summoned the state to remove the liberators. He tried to explain the difference between what they were doing and what needed to be done. The students were confusing representation for the purposes of agitation with practical reality. They performed revolution without understanding the conditions that might make revolution possible. He had seen this confusion before, in Brecht, in the fetishizing of violence that substituted gesture for genuine transformation. The compulsion to act, he argued, served only to mask how little power they actually held. By spring of 1969, Adorno felt badly battered. The attacks continued. In April, a group of female students rushed the podium during one of his lectures. They bared their breasts and surrounded him in what they called a planned tenderness attack. He fled the hall. The man who had written about damaged life found himself publicly humiliated by those who claimed to want a less damaged world. He still hoped the movement might find its way. In February, he had planned a new preface for Dialectic of Enlightenment, the book he and Horkheimer had written during the darkest years in California. He wanted it to help the protest movement achieve a consciousness that illuminates, to prevent them from succumbing to collective narcissism. The warning went unheard. In August, Adorno escaped. He left the stifling summer heat of Frankfurt for the Hotel Bristol in Zermatt, seeking what he called the pathos of distance. The Swiss mountains had always meant something to him. He wrote to Marcuse from there, trying once more to explain the situation. Marcuse was vacationing in the French Alps and would soon tell a television interviewer that there was no one who could represent Adorno and speak for him. Even old friends could not bridge the gap that had opened. Adorno kept working. He had been writing his aesthetic theory for years, defending the autonomy of art against those who demanded it serve immediate political ends. Great works wait, he insisted. A liberated humanity would be able to inherit its historical legacy free of guilt. The book remained unfinished on his desk. On the 6th of August, 1969, Adorno attempted a mountain excursion against his doctor's advice. He had described the Matterhorn as the child's image of the absolute mountain. He suffered a heart attack near its slopes and died. He was 65 years old. Months later, Hans-Jürgen Krahl died in a car accident. Max Horkheimer, who had survived his closest intellectual companion, wrote a sympathetic letter to Krahl's parents. Despite everything that had passed between them, despite the occupations and the police and the shouted slogans, the bond of solidarity remained. The tragedy of damaged life encompassed them all. Chapter 16. The Message in a Bottle Unsealed. The news arrived on the 6th of August, 1969. It caught everyone off guard. The German intelligentsia was scattered across summer retreats, the newspaper editors were on holiday, and the obituary files sat dusty and outdated in their cabinets. Nobody had prepared for this. A death notice appeared in the Frankfurter Rundschau, signed by Gretel. It read simply that Theodor Adorno, born on the 11th of September, 1903, had died quietly in his sleep. A peaceful ending. The phrase sits strangely against everything he had written about damaged life, about the impossibility of living rightly in a wrong world. He slipped away in the mountains, in the silence, after decades of refusing silence in his work. 6 days later, nearly 2,000 mourners gathered at the Frankfurt Central Cemetery. Old friends came. Ernst Bloch was there, and Alfred Sohn Rethel, but so were the radical students, the same ones who had occupied the Institute, who had driven him from his own lecture hall with their bodies and their fury. Now they stood quietly among the crowd, mourning the teacher they had rejected. Max Horkheimer delivered the eulogy. He did not hesitate to use the word genius. He spoke of a man who had mastered philosophy, sociology, psychology, and music to an almost unparalleled degree. The two of them had written together in California exile, had rebuilt the Institute from rubble, had fought and reconciled and grown old in a country that had once tried to erase them. Now, Horkheimer stood alone. Some observers noticed there were no Jewish liturgical rites at the funeral. This troubled them. Adorno had been baptized Catholic as an infant, confirmed Protestant later. His family had converted, assimilated, believed that culture would protect them. It had not. Horkheimer wrote a letter afterward, explaining that while the rituals were absent, the critical theory they had built together had its roots in Judaism, specifically in the prohibition against making a graven image of God, the refusal to name the absolute, the insistence that something always escapes the concept. Herbert Marcuse was in the French Alps when he heard. 2 days later, he gave a television interview. There is no one who can represent Adorno and speak for him, he said. My debt to him is endless, and without his work, I cannot imagine going on living. Marcuse understood that the students had rejected Adorno too quickly, that the political ruptures of '68 had blinded them to what his theory actually offered. The debate about his work, Marcuse said, has not yet begun. On Adorno's desk sat the unfinished manuscript of his aesthetic theory. He had intended to dedicate it to Samuel Beckett, the writer whose language of the lifeless he saw as the last possible comfort for a death deprived of all meaning. The book appeared posthumously in 1970, a fragment that confirmed his own dictum that great works wait. It was his final defense of art's autonomy, his argument that only in the space of the aesthetic could something resist the totally administered world. After his death, the label Frankfurt School hardened into a fixed thing. His complex, contradictory, deliberately difficult thoughts became curriculum. They entered the academic marketplace he had spent his life criticizing. Jürgen Habermas eventually took the chair at the Institute, shifting its direction toward communication theory, away from the relentless negativity that Adorno had insisted upon. Horkheimer had worried about this. He had feared the Institute would become a caricature of itself. The message in a bottle, a metaphor Adorno and Horkheimer had used during their California isolation, finally washed ashore. The dialectic of enlightenment, once a mimeographed manuscript passed among a handful of exiles, became the philosophical benchmark for a new generation trying to understand why progress kept producing catastrophe, why enlightenment kept generating new forms of domination. His grave in Frankfurt became a site of pilgrimage. People came not for comfort, not for the reassurance of a life well lived, but for something else. They came for the unwavering radicalism of spirit, for the refusal to accept the universal lie of false reconciliation. Freedom, he had written, postulates the existence of something non-identical, something that cannot be absorbed, something that escapes. His prickliness, his refusal to be one of them, his insistence on the negative, these are what remain. They ensure that his work cannot be fully assimilated by the culture he spent his life dissecting. The bottle opened. The message is still being read.